I'm Scott with BibleStudying.net, and we're continuing our study on the history of the church. We've been talking about the Apostolic Church, the house church community that they had, their way of teaching, which was interactive, that they didn't have paid local leadership, that their leadership taught humbly, that they had full communion meal, and that all of the things that we see in the church today, many of these things that relate, are borrowed, in fact, from the pagan culture, from their religious practice or their government practice, where we have basilicas or churches now today that are designed based upon modifications to the basilica, with raised special seating, a platform, a pulpit, leadership who is paid, fully paid professionals who are trained in the art of rhetoric, as the Greek orators and statesmen and religious leaders were at the time. And so we saw instead that the New Testament church didn't tithe, they gave communally, and that the local elders worked for themselves, to provide for themselves. They weren't paid by the church. And so as we take a look at these changes, we want to add a couple other things to the list of changes in the 4th century church. And the next thing we're talking about is the use of music in church meetings. The 4th century church, in fact, made a big change in music. Today we associate praise and worship with music as synonymous. If you're praising and worshiping, you're involved in some sort of singing or musical activity. That's the way we think of it. But in the New Testament, if we actually study the New Testament, we have an article, study series online about music in the New Testament and in worship. We can see that the New Testament terminology for praise and worship doesn't actually invoke music or musical accompaniment or even singing in all cases, except for I think one small exception. There are 13 words in the New Testament to refer to praise or worship or some derivative of those, and none of them actually invoke the idea of musical activity or musical accompaniment or singing. So that's pretty significant. If we do a survey of the New Testament on using these words, we're going to find the following conclusions. Of the 113 references in the New Testament to praise or worship, only 2 mention singing. 113, and there's only 2 that mention singing. So that's a pretty small amount. When we think about worship and praise in the New Testament, they're not talking about music at all, and only 2 out of 113 instances are they talking about singing. Only 5 of these 113 verses, including the 2 I just mentioned, talk about singing in an instructional setting, where the other 2 are just talking about singing happening. But now we're talking about it in an instructional setting. And so that's a pretty small percentage if you think about the amount of New Testament that's dedicated to focusing on teaching and instruction. A very small percentage, not even really worth mentioning, about musical activity. There's none for musical activity and a very small amount about singing. So the early church did not really have a use or a feature of music at their church meetings. In fact, if we look at the quote here from a church historian, it says, Christians of the first several centuries staged no public festivals, and they had no musical performances. And then if we were to look at Justin Martyr, who gives us an account of what a typical church meeting is like in the 2nd century, we can see that he mentions prayer, he mentions teaching, he mentions the distribution, he mentions communion, but he doesn't mention music or singing. And so the early church really, as we can see from the New Testament emphasis, didn't really have a big place for music at all in their worship. And in fact, if we look to where the church got this, it again comes from Greek and Roman culture. And let me just read some quotes on this. This is from a church historian. It says, the roots of the choir, that's what we see most churches today have choirs. The roots of the choir are found in pagan Greek temples and Greek dramas. The Greeks had trained choirs to accompany their pagan worship. The next quote says, the Greek musical system was the precursor of the Christian church, and the line of descent is unbroken from Greece through Rome to the Middle Ages and to modern times. The next quote from Encyclopedia Britannica says, music of ancient Greece. The function of music in ancient Greek society was bound up in their mythology. It was omnipresent at their games and at their religious ceremonies, at the beginnings of their drama. The actual sounds of music were heard at the rituals and the games and the dramas. It's according to Britannica. So we get how we feature music as a large segment of our current modern church meetings is borrowed originally from the Greek dramas, the Greek religious worship. It is not from and even from their imperial activities in which they would have these musicians herald the entrance of the magistrates at the beginning of those ceremonies. So we don't get that from the early church, which didn't really emphasize music as a feature. Not to say that music is bad or is wrong. I'm just talking about differences between the apostolic church and where we get our practice today. And so the next thing we want to mention real quickly here as another change was the incorporation of pagan holidays and pagan holiday customs that did happen at this time. It is well-known fact that for at least the first 200 to 300 years, the early church did not celebrate Christmas or Jesus' birthday or anything on having to do with December 25th. They did not. The apostolic church did not celebrate Christmas. Where we got that holiday is from, in fact, an incorporation of pagan customs at that time of year, and then they were Christianized or given Christian meaning. But there's a whole study we have on the history of Christmas online. I recommend you read it if you're interested in that. Again, we're just pointing out contrast between the apostolic church and the later church. So I'm going to read some quotes. This is from Encyclopedia Britannica. Christmas, the actual observance of the day of Jesus' birth was long in coming. In particular, during the first 2 centuries of Christianity, there was strong opposition to recognizing birthdays of martyrs, or for that matter, Jesus. So the 200 years the church would not celebrate Jesus' birthday or birthdays. This is from Columbia Encyclopedia. Christmas, the observance probably does not date to earlier than AD 200 and did not become widespread until the 4th century. This is the next quote is from, it says, both Irenaeus and Tertullian, who wrote between 170 and 210, do not mention Christmas in their list of Christian feast days. This is from Catholic Encyclopedia. Christmas was not among the earliest festivals of the church. Irenaeus and Tertullian admit it from their list of feasts. December 25th was in fact celebrated throughout the Roman and pagan world as an important day. It was the birth of their deity of the sun, who went under different names such as Sol, which is just a word for sun, or Mithra, as he may have been a more proper or common name for him in other areas. And so in the decades before Christians began to celebrate Jesus' birthday on December 25th, in the centuries and decades before that, this holiday was very popular in the Roman world around them. So let's read some quotes. The Catholic Encyclopedia says, Natalis Invicti, the well-known solar feast, was celebrated on December 25th. Has a strong claim for why we celebrate Jesus' birthday in December. The history of the solar cult, its position in the Roman Empire, and syncretism with Mithraism are all relevant. There we have, now World Book says, Christmas, the first mention of December 25th as the birth date of Jesus occurred in AD 336. The celebration of this day as Jesus' birthday was probably influenced by pagan festivals held at the time. The ancient Romans held year-end celebrations to honor Saturn and Mithra. This is from Britannica. Christmas, the precise origin of assigning December 25th as the birth date of Jesus is unclear. The New Testament provides no clues to this regard. December 25th was first identified as Jesus' birth by Sextus Julius Africanus in 221 and later became a universally accepted date. Prior to this, one widespread explanation of the origin of this date is that December 25th was the Christianizing of the day of the Sol Invictus, or the birth of the unconquered sun, a very popular holiday in Roman Empire. And then again, the next quote here talks about Mithra and how this cult of Mithra, which had a birthday, a holiday on December 25th, this is from Columbia Encyclopedia, one of the great religions of the Roman Empire. In the 2nd century AD, it was more general than Christianity. So in contrast to this, we're going to take a look at Tertullian, who has to say that at this point in time, the Christians were, in the earliest church period, turning away and not participating in these pagan things. So we'll pick up with that in just a second as we continue in the next segment.